for lack of a better word, I know it's disheartening to say, but the reality of it too is that he had given up. I mean, when it was time for him to be taken out of his cell and moved to another facility where he would prepare to be reintroduced to society with his impending release coming up from prison, he didn't want to leave. He didn't want to. He was perfectly content with staying in that environment because it had defeated him in a sense.
First, to those who are listening, welcome back to the Sunday Long Read podcast and a new episode of our Behind the Story series. This morning, I am joined by Natalia from Deseret Magazine. Natalia, thanks so much for joining the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
So today we're talking about one story in particular from last year that you wrote about one man who was in solitary confinement for more than 2 decades. Can you just initially describe how you found Frank and what that story looked like when you first found this person?
Yeah, absolutely. So kind of the genesis of how this story came to be had started when the U.S. Surgeon General had released that report on a new epidemic of loneliness back in, I believe, 2023 in the spring, if I'm not mistaken. Um, and that got me, and I feel like the rest of the country, really curious in terms of what loneliness actually does to a person. Because for the first time, we were able to understand in a very physical and tangible way that something as seemingly benign as being isolated or out of touch of other humans can affect us in really physical ways. Um, and I was reading through that report when it had initially come out, and there's a national framework that it addresses in terms of how we can circumvent some of the loneliness that has seeped into our lives, especially since the pandemic. And what I noticed is that there wasn't really any mention of what that looks like in a correctional setting. And in my mind, I mean, of course, wasn't entirely intimate or extremely familiar with what it was like to endure solitary confinement prior to writing this piece, but it's something that I had known existed. And in my mind, it was kind of the most extreme example of loneliness and isolation that we have in our society. So that got me curious in terms of how I could illustrate what we now know about loneliness through the perspective of somebody who endures it to the utmost extreme, right? Somebody who is held in solitary confinement in a prison and really has no recourse for kind of grappling with, treating that loneliness. And so I knew I wanted to write about solitary confinement, especially since it was coming on the tails of this new awakening and awareness. And I knew I wanted to tell a really human-centered and tight narrative in order to best do that. And I had been looking for a character to tell this story through in reading a lot of first-person accounts of solitary confinement. I leaned a lot on this watchdog advocacy organization called Solitary Watch, because on their website, they do this super cool thing of publishing a lot of first-person essays written by people who are in solitary confinement or had been in solitary confinement. And that's actually how I stumbled across Frank. He had written an essay that was published on this website, and I thought it was incredibly haunting. He detailed some of his experience and some of the effects of that experience really beautifully. And I knew I wanted to reach out to him and learn more about that and see if he would be willing to let me profile him for this piece.
Yeah, and we'll go into a lot of those, the details that you include in the story. But are there specific things that he wrote about in that initial essay that grabbed you? Is there anything that you remember, any specific detail from that time in solitary confinement that struck you after reading that?
I think one of the things that struck me that I recall from that piece, and certainly through talking to him later on after reading it, is this idea that solitary confinement and being held in isolation for as long as he has been, which is more than 2 decades, really just kind of shredded his own sense of time. Um, so his own sense of time, his own cognitive processing had completely been garbled by that experience, right? By being held in a cell roughly the size of a parking space for more than 22 years. It had kind of chipped away at his desire to be around any sort of light. He had a very small slit of a window that he ended up actually covering up because it began to be too much to have the daylight seep in. He at first tried to ward off a lot of the feelings and deterioration of being isolated, but eventually kind of gave in to the isolation once he realized it was as long term as it was, and stopped trying to, you know, circumvent those feelings. He stopped trying to go outside for showers or to go for uh, his allotted time in the rec yard. He really kind of just deteriorated in a way that, even though he had tried very hard in the beginning to keep his wits about him throughout the course of that isolation, he really wasn't able to. But also, that first point I brought up in terms of this idea of his own sense of time and cognitive processing being so impacted by the experience, that really stuck out to me because he had detailed that in some degree in his essay.
Yeah, I think, when you write in this piece, um, you say that in the beginning, he attempted to have that kind of structure and almost exercise routine where he's doing push ups and sit ups and pacing around the cell and like keeping himself physically um, together. And then, but of course, in the face of being so isolated, so separated for such a long period of time, um, those were some really intense details because you could imagine if you were in that situation, you might try to replicate something like that, try and keep yourself together. And then it seems like there, maybe there's not nothing you can do, but that it's just in the face of such intense separation that that just everything starts to break down.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I think his experience is one that particularly strikes a chord, especially, I mean, it did with me in the process of reporting and writing it, because he had started out, like we were just saying, with so much resolve, right, to not let this break him, as many of us would like to think that we would as well if we were ever put in a similar position. But his own experience kind of illustrates that it's a feeling of hopelessness can really be the most detrimental effect of solitary, and it really can overcome anyone who's held in isolation for that long, even somebody who had a very regimented routine in the beginning to try and avoid that very exact scenario. So
Hmm.
I think it really drives home the point that it can break even somebody with particularly regimented routines and resolve.
Right. And so when you first reached out to Frank, did you, because your story is structured where in the beginning he's on a Zoom call describing his experience in solitary. And then at the end, of course, you're sitting with him in his new apartment. Um, were those two things flipped when you were doing the reporting process? Did you meet him in person first, or was it only on this Zoom screen with a little bit of light filtering in? Um, how did those interactions start?
Yeah, so it actually was flipped. I had initially reached out to him, and when I made my initial ask, I made sure to first ask if he would be comfortable with just a preliminary conversation over a Zoom or over a phone call, totally just off the record, give him a chance to ask me any questions about who I was, what the publication I write for is, what I was trying to do, and my intentions were. And that allowed us to really get to know each other better and make him feel more comfortable. And we did a series of those other Zoom and phone calls before I was able to actually fly out and meet him in Reno, where I spent a couple days seeing his apartment, meeting his neighbors, meeting the people in his life, and kind of seeing what his life looks like now after being released several years back.
Right, because I can imagine, I mean, you talk about in this story the fact that, of course, after being so isolated for so long, it's intense to be around other people, groups of people, much less a journalist maybe interviewing him for this story. Was that something that he was wary of, or after having just experienced all of those intense new things and groups of people, was it just um, kind of par for the course at that point?
Yeah, I think in Frank's case, he really was incredibly passionate about getting his story out because he has become a very fierce advocate against the practice of solitary confinement. That opening scene in the story is an example of that. He's testified before the Nevada state legislature before in support of reform that would limit the use and practice of solitary confinement in state prisons. So in the case of speaking to me, he actually was very open in terms of sharing his story with me. Um, but I was able to see in spending time with him in person, especially, that he definitely has maybe particular boundaries or limits that are a direct effect of his time in solitary. I noticed that he still felt extremely uncomfortable around other people. When I initially met him in public, we met at a restaurant near his house, and he wanted to sit with something against his back, like with his back facing a wall, so he wouldn't have people hovering behind him as kind of a residual effect of being wary around being around other people, about close contact with other people. Um, and he still tries to filter out a lot of the sunlight, even in his own apartment. I got to see that firsthand as well with how he drapes fabric over his lamp on his bedside, or keeps his blinds shut, excuse me, even in the middle of the afternoon. And so I was able to see uh, still some of the residual effects of his time in solitary. He still definitely doesn't feel particularly comfortable in crowds or around a great number of people in public spaces, especially, but he was luckily comfortable enough to meet me and get to know me and allow me into his own space. So I feel very grateful that um, he was able to both communicate his boundaries and that I was able to respect them, but also that he was willing to allow me to, infiltrate his space a bit for the sake of speaking to him and hearing his story.
Definitely. Yeah, I think the scary details in the story, that again, you can imagine that happening to anyone being in this situation, is that um, you write that in the beginning, or kind of after a year or so, those brief moments where he is allowed to leave his very small cell, he starts to feel like he's having a panic attack, that sense of agoraphobia, like he actually begins to isolate himself more because the cell feels like the only safe place. Do you think at the time he knew that these were panic attacks, or kind of knew what was happening? Or again, I'm sure you don't have people to talk to. You can't necessarily have like this long, frank conversation about what's happening mentally. What did he say about how he processed those things at the time?
Right. So Frank had not experienced, prior to his initial panic attack while out in the rec yard, um, a panic attack before, or at least he hadn't remembered experiencing one to that same degree. So he didn't really know what it was at first, and uh, it can be very frightening for anybody to experience one for the first time. It feels more like an external thing than an internal thing, right? Like the walls are closing in on you. So he retreated into his cell because he noticed that those feelings of panic and being closed in on, those feelings of almost claustrophobia, um, happened because he was outside of his cell. And I think it took him a while to actually realize exactly what that meant. But through trial and error, he realized that anytime he would go out into the rec yard or go out into the showers to take a shower, he would start to feel that same constricting feeling again. And so through enough experiences, enough go-arounds of encountering that feeling of panic, he realized that it was directly associated with leaving his cell. And so he stopped leaving his cell. He made that decision to not go out for exercise in the rec yard and take little bird baths, as he called it, in his cell through the sink that he had there, rather than go out into the showers and take a shower, because it would mean having to leave and enter a more spacious environment that had begun to feel all too much to him. So I really don't think he initially knew what they were in terms of the panic attacks, but he quickly learned that they were directly associated with any time spent outside of his cell, and so he decided to isolate even more than he already had no choice in the matter of.
Right. Yeah, you do a really great job in this story of giving us a sense of what it was like a little bit to be in his mind at the time. You also write towards the end that he gets the chance to look in the mirror for the first time in years, and you write that there were many points during the solitary confinement where he wondered if he even existed at all. Um, I mean, how do you think? How did he say he gets to the other side of thoughts like that when he's sitting there in the cell and having, I mean, just like everything starts to break down in that way? How do you continue on?
Right. I mean, that's the question, really. In Frank's case too, he had really retreated outside of himself at any chance he could get, and I feel like that was both maybe a way of coping, but also just an involuntary response to feeling as detached from reality and disassociated as he had during that time. And what that looked like for him, some examples of that was, I mean, if he had any access or any exposure to any living thing, like if a bug had entered his cell, he would really focus in on that and just, spend as much time like touching it, talking to it, interacting with it as he possibly could, as a means of kind of escaping outside of his own head. But when that wasn't around, or when people weren't around, he had developed a relationship with a prison chaplain who every so often would visit people held in solitary and have moments of, spiritual guidance and conversation. And when he didn't have that or any other access to any living thing, which was the vast majority of the time, he would retreat inside of himself. He would have daydreams about social interactions, about meeting somebody in a grocery store and, having a conversation in the produce section. He would have flashbacks to his own childhood. He would relive memories because they were really the closest thing he had in order or in terms of um, being around people and what it felt like to be around people. So I think those were his coping mechanisms in terms of how he would keep himself going through that time period. But for lack of a better word, I know it's disheartening to say, but the reality of it too is that he had given up. I mean, when it was time for him to be taken out of his cell and moved to another facility where he would prepare to be reintroduced to society with his impending release coming up from prison, he didn't want to leave. He didn't want to. He was perfectly content with staying in that environment because it had defeated him in a sense. Um, but luckily, there were people in his corner upon his transition to the other facility who helped him step by step get comfortable around people again, who helped him practice eating around people in the mess hall and take rounds around the facility in order to see other people from a distance before he felt comfortable being more up close with them and interacting with them. And in that particular environment of the next facility that he had transitioned to, which was a lower security prison, the cells were usually several people to a room. So he was able to kind of be in his own cell out of his request and practice very slowly being around other people before he could fully reintegrate and exist in a cell where he would be bunking with other incarcerated people. So even though it had really defeated him and chipped away at who he was, that experience of isolation, he was fortunate enough that there were people who vouched for him and helped him very slowly adapt and reintroduce and find himself again, regain himself, which I think was imperative in terms of his ability to exist out in the world as he does today, and have neighbors, have a sense of community, despite feeling so incredibly alone for a quarter of his life.
Hey everyone, Amanda here with a quick intermission. If you're liking this episode and want more behind-the-scenes stories like this one, make sure to follow the Sunday Long Read podcast on Spotify, Apple, or wherever else you get your podcasts. You can also check out our website at sundaylongread.com. There you'll find original stories, our true crime newsletter, and of course, our weekly newsletter. You can become a Sunday Long Read member for only $5 a month and get early and exclusive editions of the newsletter. And now, back to the episode. I mean, you write in this story, of course, that it's the impact of solitary confinement is not just on the person that has to endure that, but then also when they are released, the general public and everyone that has to interact and live with this person. So it does, it's in everyone's best interest for this person to be as adjusted to the world as they can be before they're released. Do you think that is, or people are now understanding that and realizing that it seems like in Frank's case, he was lucky to have that experience of people trying to guide him before he was released. But it seems like that's probably not always the case.
Right. It definitely isn't always the case. And I do think that there is starting to be more of an understanding of that, of solitary confinement and isolation as not only an issue of personal mistreatment or torture, but one of public safety. Because we now know, there have been studies that show people who endure even short-term isolation have much higher recidivism rates. I believe they could be as much as 15% higher for formerly incarcerated people who endured solitary than for those who didn't. And these are people who are going to be our neighbors, right? We're going to live alongside them. We're going to be in community with them. And so it's important to think about how we can best prepare people to reintegrate into society and, of course, not endure anything that the United Nations counts as actual torture, but also how they can exist with us and with others, how they can give back to society and, find a sense of purpose in the world that they're forced to reintroduce, right? And I do think that it's a very slow understanding of that because Nevada did just recently reform solitary confinement in the sense that there's now a cap of, I believe, 15 consecutive days before a particular case of an individual will need to be at least reviewed, should they need to endure more consecutive days of solitary confinement within the Nevada state prisons. But it's only the second state in the country to do so. So we haven't really quite gotten to a point yet nationally where we understand both the personal and public effects of long-term or even short-term solitary confinement. And there's some steps toward that in terms of reforms that are taking place at the state and attempts of reform that are taking place at the national level. But it seems like it's going to be a bit of a slow awakening before we see any widespread change in that department, in terms of seeing solitary confinement as not just a personal but a public safety issue. Though at least what we've seen so far is heartening and it's promising and it's hopeful. So we can only hope that we move in that direction.
Right. if someone is reading this story, what do you hope is one of the main takeaways in their understanding of what solitary confinement can do to someone? Is there one or two things that you hope that they can take away from this?
I think one thing that is particularly important to me and was elucidating to me in the process of reporting and writing this is that last point about solitary not just being a personal issue, but a public safety issue. I would encourage readers to maybe, yes, think about how they would feel if they were in Frank's shoes and had experienced that isolation firsthand, but also think about how I might feel to um, realize that these people are going to be our neighbors and we're going to live alongside them, right? What kind of neighbor and what kind of community member would you want? Would you want somebody who feels like they've had the tools and support to reenter society, or people who feel incredibly prone to um, agitation, reoffending, um, isolation, people who wouldn't really uh, coexist with us in ways that we would prefer, right? And apart from that public safety part of the conversation, I do also think that it's maybe worth examining how we view isolation and loneliness. It does seem like there is a national trend toward taking these previously just personal problems into like a commonly held understanding that there are tools and frameworks that we can use to societally remedy them. There has been a lot of improvement in that department, and that's very exciting. But I do feel like we need to maybe continue having a conversation about how we can best abet and avoid isolation and loneliness. Yes, in our own personal lives and social circles and workplaces, but also in state and federal institutions that are largely obscured by the curtain of power, that are largely put into the hands of our public leaders rather than in our own hands. We do need to still continue to advocate for solutions that can penetrate those worlds as well, not just the worlds that we exist in personally and are confronted with more often.
Hmm.
So I would maybe say those two things, among others.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, the great thing in the goal of hoping that more people understand kind of the complexities of all of this is that um, you and this story were named as a finalist for a national magazine award a month ago, which is super exciting. What was your reaction to that news? And I'm sure that are you hoping that that will also cause more people to read this story and understand, yeah, some of those complexities of solitary confinement?
Oh my gosh, in terms of my reaction, I mean, it didn't feel real. It still doesn't feel real. Um, by the time my editor had called me with the news, I was actually uh, just starting to emerge out of a COVID bubble because I had been sick for an entire week. My brain was not functional. And so hearing that news just completely took me out of reality. I'm incredibly grateful. I'm still awestruck by it. And I am absolutely hopeful that as many eyes as possible on stories like Frank's mean that we might veer closer to a more widespread and public understanding of what it actually means to endure solitary confinement. Um, and I also hope that through a story on solitary confinement being nominated as a finalist for a national magazine award, but one that is particularly rooted and grounded in a very intimate narrative of one person's experience, I hope that that may help us not only just understand it as a policy issue, but begin to feel it and experience it secondhand in a way that makes us understand the effects of isolation and loneliness, yes, in solitary confinement, but also in all effects, right? So I'm hoping that it can kind of have a snowball effect in terms of how we view the practice of solitary, as well as how we view loneliness in our own lives and the lives of others.
Right, because I mean, like you said, it's one thing to think about the concept of solitary confinement and what that might look like. Um, but I think, yeah, until I had read your story, I don't think I've ever read an account of one person and exactly the impacts over the course of decades that um, isolation would do to someone. Um, which again is the power of narrative storytelling.
Yeah, I really do feel grateful that I'm able to pursue narrative storytelling. And I really do believe in the power of long form narrative storytelling to allow us to meet people we would have never otherwise met and experience things, feel things we would have never otherwise experienced or felt. Um, and I think for a particular story like this, I I try whenever possible to have any story I pursue be more human centered and human focused because I feel like that's most rewarding as a writer, but also as a reader personally. But in a particular story like this, I I feel like we as Americans are at least peripherally aware of solitary confinement because it does exist in state and federal prisons, and it has for quite some time. But we don't really know very much about its actual effects on a human being. We understand it as a policy issue, as something very far removed from our own realm of experience and understanding, um, and not as something that we can actually consider us being in that position of, if that makes sense. It's hard for many of us to actually place ourselves there because we know so little about it and we know so little about what that would look and feel like. So I did feel like for a story like this, I felt grateful that I was able to tell it through a narrative lens, because it offered maybe something new in the sense that it wasn't just focused on uh, the legal and political worlds that make solitary what it is, but the very human world of what solitary can look like and can can do to a person.
Right. A little more broadly, what do you see as the future of long form or narrative journalism, especially when you're writing something, are you thinking about how to craft a story in a way that might cut against someone's attention span or keep them in the story? Are you thinking about that at all when you are writing something that you know is going to be longer?
Yeah, it's a really tricky question. I think that oftentimes there is that question, right, of how I can keep the reader's attention, especially since our attention spans have shifted, our consumption of media, how we consume it, and in what forms has also shifted over the years, um, and veered ever so slightly away from spending, like an hour reading a long form story. Um, I think that in the case of this particular piece, when I mentioned earlier that I really love to tackle human centered and human focused stories, one appeal of that approach, I think, is that even if how we consume news and stories looks different and continues to change and look different in the years to come, one thing that makes us human and will always make us human is kind of our inclination to want to relate to something, right? Um, if you can find a similarity between you and a person you're reading about, you're more likely to maybe relate to them and be interested in hearing what happens to them, right? Because you can see a part of yourself in them, even if they're so entirely far removed from who you are and what your life looks like. Um, and so I think maybe leaning into the things that make us human. So in Frank's case, like I always think to the ladybug scene, right, where a little ladybug enters his cell, and it's his first interaction with a living thing. And I mean, he had lost track of time, but in quite some time. And so he was talking to the ladybug and playing with it, and um, I remember thinking that that was just so childlike and sweet and relatable. It's something that we've probably all done at some point in our lives. Me personally, I still will do that. So if we can see glimpses of ourselves in people that we read about, we can really relate to them and connect to them. And I feel like that'll keep people's attention. Of course, it isn't necessarily always possible, but when it is possible to lean into what makes us human, there's more room for overlap and commonality. And through that, I think there's more room for keeping people engaged in the stories that we aim to tell.
Right, definitely. I mean, I personally think that it seems to be a valuable direction for journalism to move in is more long form narrative, especially in the age of social media and the internet where anywhere can talk about the news or have headlines or tell us what's happening as it's happening. But it seems like that real value is having the personal stories, especially in a time where you can get quick news anywhere. Do you feel the same way? Do you hope that more editors, news outlets will give the time for that it takes to do long form?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that was incredibly well put. I mean, it's one thing to maybe get a news alert on your phone about this, this bill passed or this legal development happened. And it's another thing entirely to sit down and read about the actual effects of how that manifests, right? The human cost of what that development may be. So I think that there is a very important place for news in our lives, of course. But as the news landscape changes, what we as journalists, as writers can do, what we can offer, especially in the face of AI and encroaching technological advances that have called into question what we humans can offer that algorithms cannot. And I believe the most important thing that we can offer is the chance to understand humanity. And the best vehicle through doing that is through a long form story, is through long form narratives, through really sitting down and getting to know someone, getting to know something, right? Like policy or solitary confinement through the effects on a human being. It allows us to empathize in ways that a lot of hard news and news alerts cannot immediately lend itself to. It allows us to understand the world, understand ourselves more too, in how we relate to what we're reading about and whether we see ourselves in what we're reading about, what our reactions are. So I think that long form narrative storytelling, especially in an age of such uh, polarization and division and loneliness and isolation, all of these things that are bringing us further away from one another, we need long form stories that ground us into our humanity, that allow us to get to know people intimately more than ever. So I think it's only something that will become increasingly valuable. And I'm very grateful to be able to do it, but I do hope that we continue to see more spaces open up for this kind of long form storytelling in different magazines, news outlets across the country.
Absolutely. I mean, that's what's cool also about the National Magazine Awards is that there is this comprehensive list, regardless of, the final winners of those categories, but that there is this kind of definitive list of these are the, great places to go and stories to read if you want that human focused, human centric narrative journalism.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it'll never stop being important. Um, in fact, it's only being increasingly relevant, if you ask me. So I could not agree with you more on that.
Well, thank you so much. We will be sending good luck your way for the awards. And thanks so much for joining the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I had a great time chatting, and I appreciate it.
Thank you. This episode of the Sunday Long Read podcast was produced by Matthew Whitehurst and me, Amanda Ulrich. The co-founders of the Sunday Long Read newsletter are Jacob Feldman and Don Van Natta Jr. Until next time, thanks for listening.